Well, I have to say thank you very much for that. Those remarks. I'm going to put this down here because it's going to slide off. And just simply say that I owe an enormous amount to Barry for his determination when he was in Parliament. I personally think he should have been allowed to remain on, and it's a great sadness to me that that was not the case. But the fact is that the flame still burns, and that is the point, and that's why he is chairman of the Bruges Group, and you in the Bruges Group are effectively the foundation of Brexit. That is the truth of the matter, I can tell you for a fact. And I'm going to, just before I get into the full text of what I want to say, I want to just remind people, you know about this yourself anyway, but it's not a bad thing sometimes to have things repeated, even if you know them already. It sort of happened in, as we know, September 1988. And what we may not know is that in July, and indeed before that, I've been expressing my concern about the manner in which our sovereignty and our independence as a nation was being increasingly impugned by the encroachments of the European Union, the European community as it was. And I put down an amendment to the single market legislation that nothing in this act shall derogate from the sovereignty of the United Kingdom Parliament. I was told, in no uncertain terms, by the Deputy Speaker, when I tried to intervene to make sure I could be heard, that I was not allowed to move that amendment. I found this astonishing, and I took it up with the Speaker, and I still didn't get anywhere. But that was in June 1986. I wrote an article in the Times about it. And then I got to know Margaret Thatcher, and she became the patron, of course, of the Bruges Group, but she also was patron a bit later on when I founded the European Foundation. And I think I'm right in saying that she therefore was patron of both those organisations and no others in the political field. She understood what the Bruges Group meant, and she understood what the European Foundation meant, and what we were. And she wrote me a letter once, which is in her handwriting, and she said, "It's your persistence that will win the day." The basic point is this: that when you're dealing with a situation which is revolutionary in nature, you really only have one option, and that is you never give up. You also know why you're doing it. It's not just done as a matter of policy, it's a matter of conviction. It is in the national interest. And that is why I declined an opportunity to go into government at an early stage in 1991. And I was told by one of the whips, well, they've offered it to you. I personally, he said, didn't think you'd take it. He said, but that's the end as far as you're concerned in your political career beginning, but there we are. So, this revolution, what is it in its historical context? I just want to put this to you. I think modern history really began in the aftermath of the Wars of the Roses, and Henry VII took over, and then the beginnings, the glimmerings of modern government began to bed in, and then his son Henry VIII, as somebody mentioned to me earlier, eventually brought through the Supremacy Act, 1530s, and that was another revolution, of course, because that was taking ourselves out of the sphere of the papal jurisdiction. Then the next thing really was Cromwell and the revolution, the Civil War. And at the end of that, Cromwell died in 1658, and everyone he'd actually turned himself into a dictator, which was not at all acceptable to most of the people, and they were very fed up. So there was talk about bringing the king back. And in a nutshell, they did so in 1660, despite the fact that Charles I had been executed. And that was another revolution, followed by 1689 through to 1714, when the Jacobites and the Stuarts were thrown out, and then the Hanoverians were brought in. Those were pivotal moments, they were revolutions. And I make the comparison because I believe also, you mentioned John Bright, in 1867, after a 15-year campaign, he forced Disraeli into giving the working man the vote. They had about, I can't remember precisely, but say 200,000 people able to vote in those days, even under the 1832 Reform Act. And then by massive campaigning for 15 years, he used to have 150,000 people turning up to his meetings, believe it or not. And I wrote a book about it, which you may have come across. But the important point was this, that by forcing Disraeli into accepting manhood suffrage, albeit it wasn't perfect, he broke the mould, and that was another revolution which gave democracy to this country in 1867. And then, of course, later women got the vote, too late perhaps, but nonetheless that was the point. But the revolutionary nature of what I'm talking about really, in our present age, began in 1970, because the white paper that was produced in 1970, which I've studied and read the archives around, demonstrated that they weren't prepared to talk about sovereignty. They just wanted to talk about the more mundane questions, not the issue of constitutional change. There was one sentence in it which said, we guarantee that we will continue with the veto because otherwise it would be not in our national interest if we abandoned it, because we joined the European community, as we did in 1972, in a way that was another revolution itself. But that white paper which preceded it was actually a fundamental revolution in itself. That subjugated the United Kingdom and its sovereignty to the European Union. And when you mention Messina, of course, that's where Heath was so angry with Anthony Eden. Just as an anecdote, because I believe in serendipity, it crops up the whole time. My wife, my dear wife Biddy, who's been with me since she was 16, by which I mean we first met at 16 and we got married in 1965 when she was 20. But her grandfather chose Anthony Eden as the Member of Parliament for Warwick and Leamington. Yeah. And he remained there right the way through all these things, including Messina. And it was an important moment, although Heath was very cross about it. I don't quite know what would have happened if you'd been there. Your judgment may well be better than mine, but all I do know is it was a crucial moment, because it said we are not going to go down that road. And incidentally, I also was very pleased that you mentioned the May 1953 statements by Winston Churchill, because everything you said about it is true, and he did make that speech, and the open seas and so forth. He also said something else on which I wrote a pamphlet much later in the year 2000, which I entitled Associated but Not Absorbed, because at the end of that speech he actually makes those references as well. Churchill really did understand it, and I think one of the greatest calumnies on him is the fact that they suggest that actually, well obviously they would, wouldn't they, that he wanted the United States of Europe. The nearest he got to it was in a meeting in Missouri or somewhere, where he actually was talking about a different kind of situation, And in any case, they don't ever quite get the words right, because what he actually said is a kind of United States of Europe. He didn't mean that he wanted to join it, he just said that may be the way forward. So, fast forward, what was at stake? Well, from the outset, as the white paper itself admitted, was the veto, but they had no intention of actually keeping that veto. And I've been privy to the archives in Kew, and I've written about this a bit. And Con O'Neill was the chief negotiator, and he said basically for them that it wasn't really a fundamental importance. It was pretty much getting into the community with instructions at any price. It's well worth, if you ever get an opportunity to look it up, how completely self-indulgent and weak the negotiations were founded on. And we did go in, and it was meant to be a common market. But what was at stake was embedded in the Act of 1972, the European Communities Act, which section 2 of which, literally, by Act of Parliament, subjugated the British people to decisions that were taken by the Council of Ministers. So, I would put a question to all of you as to what you prefer. I think I know what the answer is in this audience, but the question is, what is it that the British people are going to be confronted with over the next few years? What kind of government would you prefer? Self-government? Sovereignty? Making your own laws through your own members of parliament in your own parliament, which is effectively democracy in action? Sovereignty is democracy. Without sovereignty, you can't have democracy. Or would you put, as a preference to that, are being governed by a council of ministers, by a majority vote, behind closed doors, literally, by qualified majority voting of 27 other countries, and without even a transcript of what went on? Now, I have to ask you, if anybody in this room would like to put their hand up and say, I prefer the Council of Ministers, I'd be very surprised. But I would also like to put that, actually, to a much larger audience over the next year. Because, actually, that is the question that we have to readdress. Not because, in my view, Brexit has failed, but because the movements that are taking place through the media and the manner in which questions are being asked about the Brexit process has got to be put to bed over the next few months. So I welcome the opportunity to talk about this, because actually we are talking about a revolution. In June 2016 was another revolution, and just to remind you, it took an enormous amount of day in, day out slog against the most hostile environment to get a referendum through the House of Commons. And if any one thing achieved the objectives that we share, it was the fact that we managed to get the referendum through. And the Maastricht referendum campaign of 1993 was absolutely fundamental to this, because it set out the parameters, and hundreds of thousands of people presented a petition to Parliament saying, we want a referendum. It was then followed up within Parliament, because obviously I was both campaigning inside Parliament and outside Parliament, bringing the two together with one main objective, which was to bypass the collusion between the two main parties' front benches. The most important thing, so long as John Major and John Smith were united in their determination in no way to get out of the European Union, and the whips continued and the governments whether it was Labour or Conservative, continued with that as their fundamental requirement, then we would not get out of the European Union. So it was a step-by-step approach. And so we went through from Maastricht to Nice, to Amsterdam and Lisbon. I put down many, many sovereignty amendments, trying to force issues, debates, all that sort of thing. But in the end, we had to have this referendum. And when we did eventually get it, the last thing Margaret Thatcher did in the House of Commons, as I recall, was to turn up for the debate on that referendum bill and vote with us. And that was an extraordinary moment. And she left the House of Commons very shortly afterwards and went to the House of Lords. But that was her, I think it was her final vote in the House of Commons. So all these different factors, all these different personalities, all that political will, all that conviction and belief in our constitutional arrangements, the knowledge that it was a real revolution that we were involved in, and that in order to ensure that we could extract ourselves from the revolution that took us in, which by the way was without a referendum in itself, it speaks for itself, then we had to bypass Parliament or persuade them to allow them to make an act of Parliament, because you can't have a referendum without an act of Parliament at all. So you had to get that. They thought they would lose, and let me say, I thought we would win because I had trust in the British people. How did I know we would win? Well, maybe I didn't, but I felt that we were going to win. So on that evening, on the 23rd of June, I actually was having a dinner with some friends, and they said, well, it's going to be a long night. I said, not for me, I'm going home. I'm going to bed. And they said, what do you mean? Oh, I said, I think it's going to go the right way. And I woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning or thereabouts, just put on the wireless quickly, and I happened to be at the same time as the Sunderland result, so I turned over and went back to sleep again. You see, the thing is this, the British people instinctively did not like being governed by other people. So you can present it in terms of a revolution, you can peaceful revolution. You can present it in terms of sovereignty, but ultimately it's up to the people to make up their own minds, and that's what they were given the opportunity to do. And then we won by a significant, I think actually, it could have been better run, and I think we could have got as much as 67, 72%. In the event, it was 52-48. But I now want to move on to the question of how we've gone from there in terms of legislation. Because one of the things I've alluded to is the questions that are being raised about whether Brexit has been a success or not. And I do think you need perhaps to be reminded of the fact that the most important question is whether or not we're able to demonstrate that we've got back self-government. If you get back self-government and you have your own independent sovereign government and parliament, and thank heavens we've got to talk about this in a moment, a majority of the scale that we've got, then you can carry through the revolution and you can embed it. And I have to admit that there have been moments when I've got quite worried about some of the attitudes that I've witnessed. But I would very much warn and advise all of you not to be taken in by the siren voices who say Brexit has failed. It has not failed. And I'll tell you what. There are two main elements of the constitutional outcome that we've got as a result of being able to govern ourselves again. By the way, Mr. Barnier, only last week, or this week I think it was, actually said, don't underestimate the importance to the United Kingdom of Brexit. and by comparison with us. And there's a very simple reason he said that, because they're locked in not just to the European Court of Human Rights, but also to the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And nobody said this yet. And under the Charter of Fundamental Rights, there are a whole stack of laws that have been made which are part of this retained EU law issue, which is one of the most boring and most important bits of legislation that I've ever had to endure. And I managed to persuade Rishi, and he accepted that you had to get the retained EU law bill through, and we had a big fight with the House of Lords over it, as you know, but it did go through, and the result of that is we can now revoke or reform European laws. I was disappointed the sunset went, but at the same time, the powers to do it, and an amendment I put down towards the end of the proceedings, which was accepted by Rishi Sunak, had provided us with the means of being able to amend, repeal and revoke all European law. And that is absolutely fundamental, because the supremacy of EU law, thanks to our not unregretted past Prime Minister Theresa May, actually kept what's called retained EU law instead of engaging in the process of getting rid of it slice by slice. It could have been done. But she retained this concept, which actually imposed on the British Parliament the obligation to accept the supremacy of the principles of EU law, but in the operation of the courts and the civil service. So all the laws that were passed in those years from 1972 through to 2020 were all still on the statute book, and the absolute intention was to retain those as a matter of principle, and that meant the supremacy of EU law would continue but be administered by our courts. This was crazy, and we had a big fight over this, but we did win. And I had a big meeting with Boris in number 10 on the 17th of October 2019, and I managed to persuade him. I won't get into all the details. I was in there from about 9:30 in the morning till 12:15 the following morning. Barney Reynolds, who's come back into the room, joined us at around 7:30 or 8, I think. And the point is this, that the real question was, were we going to get a guarantee of sovereignty in an Act of Parliament? I could give you all the details. The word notwithstanding, which you'll hear about, was part of that formula. And the bottom line is, Boris agreed with me and faced down all the legal advisors and all the other paraphernalia of the establishment. And we got it through. And in case of the retained EU law, to give you a glimmer of hope, I presented Rishi with a very good, to use the word analysis, which Barry mentioned, a very reasoned analysis of why you needed to get the Retained EU Law Act through, because there was a lot of opposition to it. And actually he faced down the establishment, the lawyers, the civil servants, the government legal service and so forth, and did actually say, I'm going to go through with this act, and he did. So let's just hope that in the next phase on immigration, which I'm going to finish with, we do actually get what is needed. And we can, because we're an independent country, and Barnier understands that, the European Commission, elected by you, in your own parliament, passing laws which are on our terms and not driven by the framework of law created by the European Union. That is a revolution. That's why Brexit is a revolution. Now, just very quickly, if I mention, on trade, I just want to, because people say, oh, our trading relations are not as good. Well, in a nutshell, otherwise I'd go on all night. The IEA have produced an extremely interesting paper, which I don't think anyone can seriously question, that actually our trading relations with the rest of the world and with the EU have actually been good by comparison. Don't forget we had COVID, don't forget that was £400 billion worth of debt. Don't forget we had the Ukraine, which forced up the cost of living, all those things. That's really why we're unpopular. But unfortunately, even Jeremy Hunt couldn't bring himself to tell us that in the House of Commons, instead talking about a historic cutting of taxes, which I don't think many people find terribly convincing. But actually, the success of Brexit, which he only mentioned in brief once, is enormous. And I'll give you just the AstraZeneca issue, where they actually prohibited it from coming to the United Kingdom, but we managed to get past that. The fact that we no longer have to pay 18 billion, 14 billion net a year into the European community. The whole of the nuclear policy, the whole of the competitiveness, City of London, even the House of Lords have now said that the City of London is doing very well under Brexit compared to, as you quite rightly said, what George Osborne was saying in that infamous pamphlet that cost £10 million, which was the question of pure misleading information in order to win the vote in the referendum, called Project Fear. So basically, if I look at the figures with our trade in the Commonwealth, which I got from the House of Commons Library yesterday, actually since 2016-17, as compared to from 1999, where it barely went above a balance, we had a deficit with the Commonwealth in about 10 years between 1999 and 2010. We never rose on a balance in our favour of more than 5.5, and now we've even reached in 2020 we reached 10.4 billion. In other words, in a nutshell, our trading relations with the Commonwealth, contrary to Project Fear, have actually been relatively, if not spectacularly, stable, and in many respects very good. Last year in 2022, the balance of trade in our favour was 8.2%, and in 2021 it was 10%. That's pretty good, and the year before it was 10%. So that's pretty good. And the IE have disposed of the arguments, in my opinion, regarding trade with the EU, and I think therefore we can genuinely say that on the trading front, Brexit has been a successful, but it can get better and better, and must do so. Now, on immigration, I'm just going to be quite quick about this, because we had this adverse judgment the other day, and I come back to the question of sovereignty and making our own laws. That is why, although you haven't heard me say it yet, it is a battle between sovereignty on the one hand and the question of international law on the other. And I have spent the last 10 days writing papers, meeting number 10, talking to all the government ministers concerned, including Rishi Sunak, because we cannot allow a situation, as the net migration figures demonstrated in terms of legal migration, to have the amount of people coming in. We simply can't afford it. It's not a question of lack of compassion or whatever other circuit. We've got to get people to do work in this country, which doesn't require people coming from elsewhere. And we've got to make one of our top priorities. Not only that, however, we've also got to be sure that we get rid of the illegal migrants. And you've seen the shenanigans, and you've seen the business of the High Court judgment. I want to tell you something which, of course, the BBC won't mention, and I just think I'll give you this by way of a kind of summary of all the arguments about this revolution and what it means and what we can do. Because buried in the dense prose of this incredibly long judgment, there is a concession. No, there is an admission. There is a doctrine which is reasserted. And what it says, if Parliament unambiguously, clearly and expressly legislates and demonstrates the intention of Parliament, said the High Court, we will obey that instruction from Parliament. So there is absolutely no reason why, if the bill which is currently being discussed. You've heard about the treaty and the emergency. I don't want to talk about Rwanda. That is a separate question. And I could debate with you whether it's going to do the job or not. The real question is, do you go to the root of the problem and produce laws that are enforceable in the Supreme Court, which will actually be enforced to enable us to stop illegal migration by our own sovereign act of Parliament, in line with the wishes and in line with the democracy and in line with what the people of this country are demanding? It's got to be done. So I say that we have the power to do it thanks to Brexit. Just as, for example, on online safety. There is a piece of legislation on online safety in Europe, but they can't do what we can do. And I managed with Miriam Cates, and I want to mention the New Conservatives, because they're the people to look for, I promise you. Danny Kruger and Miriam Cates are the future, and all the people supporting them. And they will grow because they are tough, articulate, they have hearts of gold, they have spines of steel, and they are to be believed. So that online safety bill, I proposed an amendment to put big tech losses behind bars for 2 years. They can't and couldn't do that in the European Union. We can, and we've done it. That means that tens of thousands of young people online who are currently being sucked into this black hole by algorithms and committing self-harm and suicide on unprecedented scale, as they do in America, can now be solved by our own laws in our own parliament being passed to allow us to be able to convict people and send them to jail for 2 years, which actually might not be enough, but it's enough in itself. And these are examples of how getting our whole ability to govern ourselves is real, and we've got to turn these arguments into tangible illustrations of the effect that it has on daily lives, which is why I mentioned online safety. Everybody I know is worried about what their children are watching these days. It's a real scourge of the present day. And this bill allows us to do it and send them to jail if they wittingly do it, and engross them in this black hole that they inhabit and commit suicide. So here we are. Brexit has worked. We cannot allow sovereignty to prevail just simply as a slogan. Sovereignty is democracy. And I can tell you that all the court cases that I've been looking at it and have sent off to number 10 and discussed with them demonstrate that where the laws we make are clear and unambiguous, they trump international law. Remember that as we go forward in the next few weeks. Trump international law by sovereignty. And where does our sovereignty come from? It comes from Brexit. And it comes from Section 38 of the Withdrawal Agreement Act. That evening, that day, there's 10 hours of debate, which Boris endorsed. We must never forget that. So I say in conclusion simply this: there is only one word or one sentence I can really encapsulate all this with, and that is, you the people are the voters. You have the right to know that you, when you cast your vote, elect members of Parliament who make their own laws. They have the debates, but they're not stopped by the European Union. They're not stopped by the Charter of Fundamental Rights, because we got rid of that. And therefore, there is one slogan which I will leave you with, one thing we have to remember. All this last 30 odd years, 40 years, as Barry said, as I move towards retiring from the House of Commons, there is one thing that I will always hang on to, and one thing I will always live by: never give up.